Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Active Inference Insights. I'm your host, Darius Parvizi-Wayne, and today I'm thrilled to be speaking with Conor Heins. Conor is a PhD student, although he just told me he just finished his PhD at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behaviour, as well as a researcher at Versus AI. His work focuses on the apparent teleology of complex systems, and especially how they can be described as conducting variational Bayesian inference over their environments. Thus, Conor leans heavily on active inference and the free energy principle in his analysis of collective behavioral systems. And so he's the perfect guest for today's episode. Conor, thank you so much for being here. I'm super excited to learn from you. I need to put my technical hat on because your papers are technical, but I think there's a lot that non-technical audiences will be able to get out of them. And I
Yeah,
wanted to
thanks so
start.
much for having me.
No, it's
Appreciate it.
genuinely, it's absolutely my pleasure. I feel like psychology or cognitive science likes taking the unit of analysis as the individual and then saying, okay, how can we extrapolate from the individual to describe group dynamics? So I wanted to start very broadly with a kind of axiomatic question about when you study collective systems. Is there a difference between collective behavior in and of itself, like what you talk about in terms of collective behavior, and then the behavior of an aggregation of individuals who we can say belong to a group? So is there something over and above the behavior of individuals when we talk about collective behavior?
Yeah, I mean, this question is one of the motivations for why I ended up studying this. And I think it ties into like what I would say is a larger unifying theme of complex systems in general. Complex system science, I think if you could like sum it up in one phrase would be more is different.
Mm,
The whole is greater or different than the sum of its parts. And that is really evident, I think, in the study of collective behavior. So, yeah, I would say that there's something absolutely different about kind of blurring your eyes, so to speak, on the individual components of a system and treating the system as a thing, as an emergent thing. And there's a lot of theories about whether that's like an epiphenomenal thing. Is that just something that exists on a descriptive level? Or does this larger thing, like a flock of birds or a school of fish or a society or an economy, does it in some way have like causal power and influence on these like micro level individuals? But
right.
I think like the larger, if the last like whatever 30 years of complex system science has shown us that yes, there is something qualitatively different about the bigger picture than just an aggregation of individual components.
Yeah, I think in terms of, let's say, socio-cultural groups, the top-down influence is quite transparent. I mean, in terms of an economy, the economy that you function in presumably has a kind of circular causality with the agents in the economy.
Totally.
I'm wondering whether, in terms of more mechanical complex systems, so even in, let's say, simulation work, is there something that emerges ontologically in terms of the actual dynamics of the group as a whole that can't be reduced to, let's say, just like a summation of those individual behaviors? And I guess in that, even if there is, can we distinguish that from top-down causality? So, as you say, you might have something which like is ontologically different. You can actually say, okay, this is a different phenomenon. But where do you see the top-down causality coming in before we get to, let's say, languages or broader cultures or economies?
Yeah, no, that's a hotly debated topic effectively. So there's a lot of work that's kind of trying to actually quantify the amount of top-down causation that there is. Because of course, like we can always define some set of macroscopic or coarse-grained variables from an ensemble of microscopic variables. Like
Mm,
say I have a bunch of particles or a bunch of gas particles. I can take like averages like and come up with quantities like the temperature or the average mass or the average velocity. The question is that coarse grain variable actually doing anything to that lower level? Does it feed back down? And my intuition is even in simulation, yes, there is. And people have tried to quantify this. There's people like Lionel Barnett and Anil Seth at Sussex, University of Sussex, who have come up with quantities like dynamical independence. So there's an idea where these coarse grained variables don't just act as descriptors or aggregators of lower level constituents, but they end up having their own causal power.
right.
And like intuitively, when you hear that, it's quite hard to imagine how that's possible. But it's, I think it's one of the most fascinating and kind of magical things about complex systems is that basically these slower, like both like spatially and temporally coarse grained variables end up kind of accumulating a life of their own, and they can in fact influence and in some ways be more predictive of the lower variables than just taking the whole like ensemble of lower variables as predictors themselves. I don't, to be quite frank, although I'm quite confident this exists, I don't have a great intuition for how that's possible, because it kind of flies in the face of the last 200 years of reductionist science, which is basically saying that the only causal direction is up. Everything starts like with gluons and quarks, and then you kind of build the universe up from there. But all this research is suggesting that there is some degree of downward causal influence, and ontologically it's actually quite philosophically difficult to like reckon with that. I don't know why that is.
Yes, I mean, I wonder whether it's just a slightly different type of causation from the kind of gluons or quarks up, in the
Yeah.
sense that, going all the way back to Aristotle, people talk about constraint versus causation, and it might be that just
Mm,
macro systems constrain the organization of microsystems. But yeah, it's
yeah.
a massive question. And yeah, as you said, it's very philosophically rich. I mean, strong emergence, weak emergence, all of this kind of stuff is
Exactly.
really philosophical.
Yeah.
Excellent. Going to sort of humans, or our in silico simulations of humans or cognitive agents. Um, when you sort of run these in silico simulations, you equip. I read one of your papers, and you equip them with social information, right? Social priors. So in one of yours, you had distance to their neighbors, or you would have
Mhm.
the rates of the change of the distance. I'm wondering whether would it be possible, do individual agents need to be equipped with these social priors to become social agents,
Mm.
or is there a way that actually just by acting and, let's say, having a shared goal but without actual reference to the presence of other agents, we
Mm.
have this kind of gestalt, or we have this kind of emergence of a overall pattern?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. Basically, there's different ways you can effectively introduce correlations or coupling between agents. The way that we think, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that animals and agents in society do correlate each other's activity is through either directly or indirectly perceiving aspects of the other. Like we can see each other. Schooling fish can sense their neighbors. Bacteria can sense each other in kind of like all sorts of interesting ways. But there's nothing qualitatively saying that you can't couple a system of particles with some like third core, like driving or common source. So, for instance, if I have a bunch of particles trying to navigate towards a food source on some like media, like they're all attracted by biochemical gradients towards a food source. Of course, that will induce correlations in their activity. So it will seem like they're all moving as one, whereas in fact, there's nothing that's actually letting them sense each other, but they're just some kind of common source that's giving the appearance of correlated activity. And this like is a very this is a classic thing that comes up in neuroscience too. When we're looking at large recordings of neurons, oftentimes we're not recording the whole brain, right? We're just looking at some small subsection of neural activity. And you see all these correlations between neural firing patterns, and you say, oh, look, they're connected. And
Mm,
people use all kinds of correlational techniques to infer the nature of those interactions. Oh, this neuron is driving that neuron. But you actually never know if there's some third causal driving force that's actually responsible for correlating their activity. And this
right.
is actually one of the nice things about studying collective animal behavior. Like in the lab of Ian Cousin, where I did my PhD, they have the ability to kind of track with high resolution a bunch of individuals, like every individual in an ensemble, in a collective. And they can even reconstruct kind of to some extent the visual fields and the sensory fields of the individuals in the group. And in that way, they can kind of decouple these potentially third correlating or
Mm.
confounding factors from the actual use of social information that the
That's
individuals might be utilizing.
cool. That's interesting. Yeah, because I can imagine without that, it can be very confounded, and it makes me think: to what degree here is collective behavior genuinely advantageous for these organisms? And I guess it comes to a kind of evolutionary question, because there
Yeah,
is this evolutionary debate about what is the transmitted thing over epochs? Is it the actual gene, the species, collective, and so on? When
exactly.
you know, in some sense, if we just say, okay, well, there are these there are these aggregations of individuals which have similar goals and therefore look as if they are acting in accordance with one another. And
Mm,
obviously, when you start recognizing others, well, then you have to start taking them into account.
mm.
In your work, have you got any intuition as to whether the presence of others with shared goals is actually beneficial for the organism who's pursuing that individual goal, or whether it'd be better if we all siloed off and an island onto ourselves?
Yeah, that's like a really perennial question in the study of not only collective behavior but like sociobiology, kind of in its original formulation by like E.O. Wilson. Is you know is there something inherently advantageous to group living? And if so, it's clearly not a be all end all, because we do have the presence of species that are like solo predators, like wild cats, right? They're not living in herds, but then there's other animals that are actually living in groups, and so there's clearly some trade off there. So I think one answer that probably biologists, because I have to admit, like I often theorize very high level with concepts from physics and mathematics, but there are clear individual fitness and more selfish gene related motivations for group living. Like a classic one that has been used to motivate flocking and schooling fish is like predation risk. If you're living in a group, you're basically lowering the chance that any particular individual gets predated, and there's also interesting psychological effects that flocking has on predators. Like there's a
Mm.
crowding effect, so if there's a bunch of individuals in my visual field, it's harder for me to focus on a single one,
Ah,
so that
okay, yeah, nice.
collectively lowers the predation risk of everyone in that
Yeah,
collective.
yeah, yeah.
So that's one answer to that. There's another interesting answer, which I don't know, this is maybe a little controversial, and I think this is where it really ties into the free energy principle, which is once you have a collective system, regardless of whether it's actually beneficial to the individuals that partake in it, if the system has dynamics that kind of allow it to survive, it's kind of created now its own selection pressure on it in of
Mm,
itself. So the system, simply by existing and not dissipating, is kind of like self-evidencing or
mm,
selecting itself at perhaps like a higher dynamical scale. And this is where I think concepts like the free energy principle, which is really in the game of defining why things persist in the first place and what it means to be a thing, has something to say about collective behavior. So I would actually argue that there's certain kind of group dynamics that exist, sometimes even at the expense of the individual fitness. But once you've entered into this macro scale, the macro scale is kind of living and trying to find evidence for its own
yeah,
existence,
yeah,
even if that goes back and punishes the individual actors that actually originally like cooperated to create it.
yeah.
That's a little bit more controversial, but I think it's a really good maybe framework for understanding kind of like maladaptive group dynamics, things like misinformation or virality in
Right.
social networks, things like that.
Well, the Marxists will be screaming that you've got a great theory there of capitalist realism.
Exactly. Yeah.
um, yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess as a with a more philosophical bent on this, one thinks, well, where's the kind of locus of control here?
Mm,
Because I think intuitively we don't think that the group dynamics have control or agency, like the overall arc of a culture has the agency of its constituents individuals.
mm,
But this
yeah.
idea that there's like, again, I think it comes down to a kind of constraint causality distinction.
Mm,
There are certain things that say that you can do within capitalist America versus what you could do in communist Russia,
mm,
and those act as constraints without there being some homunculus. I mean, obviously there are homunculuses insofar as there are political figures,
mm,
but no, that's a really interesting point. I
yeah.
think also what I've been thinking about is, and this is a even deeper question, is, and I'm wondering whether you have to think about this when you talk about collective behavior and aggregating individuals. Do you ever think at what point does one individual end and what and when does it when how can we distinguish one individual from another? And I know that sounds stupid because people would just say, well, it's the body, and you just have it, you just see them. And obviously when we're talking about high level evolved systems like the visual system, then it probably is based on v1 picking out lines which distinguish individual um individual organisms. But I'm
Mm,
curious, in terms of the actual Bayesian mechanics and the free energy principle, is there anything that gives us individuated thingness beyond taking that as a kind of axiom, like, oh no, there it just is a thing that is self-evidencing.
No, yeah, I don't think it does. I think that's one of the challenges of maybe what the general problem would be called is like system identification or Markov blanket identification. How do I like look at some high dimensional system and actually pick out what are the individuals or the components of that system? And even within like biological systems, it's often not that clear. Like you and me might look at hill of termites or ants, colony of ants, and say, okay, yeah, those individual ants are the individuals. But in a system where they all share the same genetic material, it
Mm,
becomes a little bit unclear. And especially when you have these kind of self-immolating sacrifices for the good of the collective,
right.
you start thinking about things like the extended phenotype. Like, are these individuals actually individuals, or are they kind of just manifestations of some common gene pool? They're kind of like the tools and the fingers that the gene pool is using to act in the world.
Mm,
So I don't think that Bayesian mechanics has any like strict definition about what a thing has to be. I mean, people will disagree with me on this. Like, for instance, the recent work from people like Carl Friston on particular things, strange kinds. This line of papers actually makes particular arguments about what constitutes a thing, and it has to do with a particular set of dynamical constraints between the different subsets of a thing. Like there's active states and sensory states, and there's certain conditional independence relations that have to exist. So the proposals have been made, but I don't think anything about Bayesian mechanics actually tells you how to do the partitioning of the state space. It's like
right.
given a state space, we can then start interpreting the dynamics of that thing as doing some sort of Bayesian inference. But where the actual state space comes from, that's a much deeper question that I think is like an active
Mm.
area of inquiry.
That's really, yeah, that's fascinating, because I guess one way of doing it would be that you act like a scientist in some way, and you go, well, if these things are behaving differently, let's say you got two ants that are behaving differently, they're diverging in their movement, then you would say, well, we can make the assumption that their active and sensory states are different, their Markov blanket is different. But if they're replicating one another, then you know that, or even that decomposition of the system into sensory states and active states kind of informs you to say that that's one overarching thing. And again, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I like recruiting kind of a philosophical vagueness here, which is that, like, from a philosophical perspective, it's probably just an empty question. And
Mm-hmm.
there is, it's well, what point does a pile of sand become a heap, or
Exactly.
and so on, and it's empty, if not interesting, and maybe beneficial when we're talking about, well, I think there are phenomenological effects about, to what degree do I recognize myself as a kind of siloed off individual versus part of a group. And there are probably
Mm,
very aberrant ends to that spectrum, like social isolation versus schizophrenia, where I'm kind of melting into the world versus being completely alone. So I think
totally.
there's import, but yeah, I recognize that it's
Yeah, I do think, yeah, I totally agree on a philosophical level. There is no hard line in the sand. There's not going to be some be all end all definition. Like eventually what will be our deciding factor is the utility, or like I
yeah.
guess the more pragmatist sort of stance is like the partition we choose for a particular system, is it going to help us do something? So for instance, in a lot of my interest in collective animal behavior, I've just been mesmerized by like videos of schooling fish, right? And
Mm,
these schools are not like cells in the sense that, the I mean, cells potentially violate this as well, but the position and the role that individuals play within the school are not fixed, right? So fish can like go to different sides of the
yeah, yeah,
school.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Some fish can kind of act as the eyes and ears of the school, while others are acting more like the leaders. So you have like spontaneous change in roles and leadership. And that already is basically telling you that at the higher level, at least, the kind of sensory states are not assigned like unchanging individual identities. So already the partition we use, if we want to start studying the school as an individual, that partition has to kind of supersede individual identity. It has to be some spatiotemporal coarse graining of like the movements and identities of different fish or particles over time.
That's good.
And which partition we use should be a function of like what question or what hypothesis we're trying to answer.
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
so
yeah.
it comes down to this teleological or pragmatic motivation. for the
Have
dev
you
team.
got, seems like a much more banal question, but I'm just curious because I don't know that much about collective behavior in biology. Have you got a particular favorite of collective behavior? You mentioned schools of fish. Is there anything else that kind of stands out as impressive?
Yeah, so schools of fish is probably my top one, just because they're visually so mesmerizing. I mean, starling flocks are quite interesting as well, particularly because so it often happens that in many realistic schooling scenarios, although you'll have three-dimensional schools, this is something I learned from my advisor Ian. In practice, a lot of the schooling actually is happening in two dimensions. So even three-dimensional schools are actually made up of more like 2D manifolds. Whereas if you look at starling flocks, they have very interesting three-dimensional structure. So
Mm.
you've probably seen these like what they call murmurations, like these kind of shimmering and they almost look like chaotic, like strange attractors, the way
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah, yeah,
they
yeah.
fold over on themselves. And even those have like quasi two-dimensional structure, but they're those two-dimensional planes are moving in 3D space. And so stuff like that is just visually very interesting. And there's a lot of really interesting research, like trying to do high resolution recording in 3D of all the birds in a flock and trying to track them. So I think that's a really a beautiful one. But again, it comes back to your earlier question: is what is the actual function of that?
Mm.
Sometimes these murmurations are very beautiful and like impressive, but people still don't really know like what the function of like such crazy displays of collective coordination are.
Yeah, and it brings to mind what you mentioned about the fact that there's actually a conversation I had with Carl because we were right at the the first episode of this podcast. We were talking about, well, what is the imperative? Carl, originally spoke about an existential imperative underlying the free energy principle, but it's a slightly misleading term because it doesn't say that you know we have to do anything, right? I could just disintegrate right now. It's saying that if I do persist, then I look as if I am doing variational Bayesian inference and so on. So I said to
Yeah.
him, I said, well, but is there an underlying telos to, is there an evolutionary pressure to survive, right? This is just a kind of a biological self truth. And
Hmm.
he went, yeah, and you kind of see that because there are not many animals that kill themselves, right? Like there does seem to be some underlying pressure or some self-evidencing survival in a way, like survival is self-evidencing. But it does bring to
Mm.
mind this really interesting fact that there are some animals who will self-immolate, um, and I think that is so interesting. Um, is there any kind of idea about beyond? We mentioned ants and termites, and I think that's kind of altruism for the group.
Mm.
Um, are there any other examples that? Well, I'm wondering if there's any examples that might just be very tricky to explain under a kind of Bayesian mechanics or under an active inference. I mean, and
Mm.
we can expand that question more broadly and just say, is there any animal collective behavior that you just find staggeringly odd under like an embedded Markov blanket system?
Yeah, I mean, I think like so one of the main reasons I went into the collective motion in particular, like the schooling fish and and kind of flocking birds, was because I found them to be exactly those examples that violate the kind of classic image we have of Markov blankets, where you have like kind of layers of states that are not really changing. Like you have the particles on the edge of the blanket, and then you have the ones that are a little more inside, and then finally you have like the kind of hard nucleus of states.
Yep.
So I find that even like basic collective motion kind of evades proper understanding under the current iterations of Bayesian mechanics. I mean, this is part of the reason the paper you mentioned that kind of studies like frames individual elements of like a school as like active inference agents.
Mm.
That paper actually didn't try to formulate the whole school as a collective. That was one of the other objectives I had during my PhD, and it's something I'd still like to study if I have time. But I found that actually doing proper Bayesian mechanics on the whole school, as if the school is the unit of analysis, was quite difficult, precisely because collective motion is an example where the roles that individuals play is changing dynamically. So if we are to find like a stable Markov blanket description that satisfies all the tenets of the free energy principle, we will have to kind of come up with a more dynamic version of system identification that allows you to kind of dynamically redraw who is a sensory state, what parts of your
Yep.
high dimensional state space are playing the role of active versus sensory versus internal dynamically over time. So I think even like the most kind of basic examples, ant colonies as well, right? They're dynamic mixing system, although the roles are more genetically predetermined for social insects. Though all these examples, I think, are a bit of a challenge to the classic formulation of Bayesian mechanics.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess one of the earlier critiques of active inference was that it's a kind of state-based, formalism,
Mm,
which doesn't allow for kind of dynamic change, as you say, and over timeness. And
mm,
I recognize, I think this is something that actually came up in a odd Twitter discussion between Maxwell and Kate Nave about path integrals and the path dynamics. It might be, you're right at the forefront of this research. Maybe it's worth just for the audience unpicking what is the difference between a kind of state-based or static active inference versus a path-based active inference, which allows for this kind of, well, I think of metamorphosizing Markov blankets or something like that.
yeah, yeah, for sure. So the classic variant of deriving the free energy principle rests on specifying like what's called a steady state distribution. So it's actually just a probability distribution over the states of the system that should not change. And this is, this can generally be applied to many systems, at least on some time scale. Like, so it seems like the distribution of particles in a rock or
Mm,
in me and you, for example, doesn't seem to change on quite so long of a time scale. Of course, the rub is in how do I define what a state is? Is a state
right.
a particular cell because cells are turning over all the time, or is it maybe a tissue, things like that? But anyway, the basic free energy principle, as it was, I guess as it was pedagogically described. This is I'm referring to papers like the free energy principle for a particular physics, the
Mhm,
monograph from
mhm.
2019. So the idea is you have this stationary distribution over states, and it's a like very trivially a multivariate system. So there's a potential for some of those states to be active states, sensory states, internal states. You've kind of partitioned the system. But what's important is that over long times, if I measure the system, the probability distribution of being in this part of state space or this part of state space, that probability is fixed. It doesn't change over time. So it still allows for particles to move around if I look at the individual trajectories. Like
Mm,
things can change, there can be fluctuations, but the stationary density, the probabilities are constant.
yeah.
That's in contrast with the more recent path integral or path formulation, where it's not the distribution over the states themselves, like finding my position in this part of the room at over time on average, but it's more a probability distribution over paths or trajectories themselves. So the point of this is that um, there's also a stationary measure or a stationary distribution, but it's not over particular points in state space, but it's rather over sequences of points.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that allows you to have a lot more flexibility in the dynamics where you can have things that appear non-stationary in the sense of if I look at just the positions of the variables, that will be changing over time. But it's because there's actually a more like abstract stationary measure, which is operating on the paths or the sequences of variables of the system. So yeah, this is what allows. Apparently, this is I think what's going to be upcoming as we see this formulation unpacked more, especially in terms of simulations. We're going to see versions of this Bayesian mechanics applied to systems that are moving in time and not stationary. And this is only something you can get with the path-based formulation.
So when you talk about the states, so we're either talking about the sort of path that states take or the kind of position that they have at a given time.
Mm,
What part of the Markov blanket are we talking here? Because some people talk about the internal states, uh, parametricizing beliefs over external states, and they're self-evidencing. And
mm,
then some people talk about the actual blanket states, or the particular, or well, some people talk about blanket states reducing VFE, or some people talk about the particular states, which is the blanket states plus the internal states. So when
mm,
we're talking about states tending towards an attracting set,
mm.
what are the commitments that we're making here in terms of which states those are?
So yeah, people will disagree on this. I mean, in the original formulation of the free energy principle, it should be all of those things.
Yeah,
So blanket, sensory, active, and internal all have a stationary distribution defined over them.
right.
So it's basically the joint distribution of all the subsets of states. That's the thing that should be unchanging.
Is
And
that
it also
including? Would that include the external states, or we're allowing those to have some
that
non, chaotic element to them?
Yeah, I mean, for the mathematics and the original formulation to work, you actually also need the external states to be unchanging, which is one of the critiques that the free energy principle had got, is like, you're not really defining a stationary system to be the system per se, like the
Mhm.
agent, but you're actually including the whole world
Yeah, yeah,
the agent is embedded in as part of your stationary measure. And you could make arguments that, oh well, it's referring to just the eco niche, like the behaviorally relevant part of the agent's world that it's trying to control. So
right.
it's kind of like the agent is forcing its external states to
Yeah.
obey the stationary measure. But I think the path-based formulation allows you to get around that, because all these things now become non-stationary if
Mm.
considered in terms of just raw states. But yeah, originally it does include all the subsets of states.
But it sounds like even when we're talking about the change of the path of states, there still seems to be some kind of predetermined characteristics or predetermined attracting set, such
Mm,
that that path is tending towards a certain probability.
for
So
sure.
you allow for some what Carl would call sort of itinerancy, or some deviation from that ideal, but you've
Hmm.
still got some pre-characteristic dynamics. I'm just wondering, you'll know a lot more about physics than I do. How much does that really square with kind of fundamental physics or our understanding of the world? Like, is it actually feasible to say, even if we allow for some itinerancy and change over time, there's like a mathematical way that you could still describe that?
Yeah, I think that actually that assumption is quite consistent with physics, because I mean there's a lot of like equivalency between these different things. So as soon as I say, oh, these stochastic differential equations tend toward some attracting set,
Hmm.
another way of saying that is I've just written down a particular form of their flow, like the way that they change over time, some particular equations of motion.
Yeah.
And if those equations of motion meet a few basic constraints, like one of them is that they don't diverge infinite into positive or negative infinity, which is like I think a pretty safe assumption. I mean, if we were assuming all of our equations diverges to infinity, we wouldn't be able to do much with them. So as long as you say that this equation doesn't diverge to infinity, another way of saying that is there is some measure that this belongs to. It basically will tend towards something with constant probabilities. And those constant probabilities in certain systems will be better described in terms of paths rather than states. So like the paths of the system will have constant probability. So although that sounds like restricting, it's actually just a statement of writing down any differential equation that doesn't have some crazy like kind of impossible form.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Final question on the physics, because you did a reply to this. How particular is the physics of the free energy principle paper
Mm.
by Aguilera and colleagues?
Mhm.
And I just was really curious because it's very much pertains to what I was saying about what states are we talking about, the particular states, the internal states, the blanket states. And you say in that paper, and I can quote, I express general agreement with the target article's statement that the marginal flow of internal states does not point along variational free energy gradients evaluated at the most likely internal state. However,
Mm.
in this commentary, I focus on the flow of particular states, intern brackets internal and blanket states, and their variational free energy gradients, and the average flow of these systems do point along variational free energy gradients. And in my
Mm.
notes, I've literally just written, what does this mean?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up, because I wrote another commentary, I think, on the same article that was a lot more like it was more about this sparse coupling conjecture, and that one actually didn't get much attention. But so yeah, that effectively this is a very interesting point, because the one of the main hypotheses of the free energy principle, and this manifests in terms of like particular process theories like predictive coding, is that if you look at the internal states of some system, they're pointing directly towards the free energy minimum. So
Hmm.
either on average, or if it's deterministic for a particular path, the system looks like it's minimizing free energy very nicely.
Hmm.
So in the same way we train deep neural networks to exactly maximize the ability to predict the test data, we train predictive coding networks to exactly minimize free energy. So they're taking like the direction of steepest descent towards the free energy minimum. And at that minimum is where your inference is best. You're
Yeah,
at the local minimum of the free energy. Your inference over external states is the best it can be
right.
given your
Generative.
approximate posterior and your generative model. So what Aguilera et al.'s paper found is that if you look at like very simple stochastic differential equations, these are like in this class of linear systems. So they're very easy to analyze. And they're probably not the best model of the more complex systems we're actually interested in biology, but they're a really good starting point. What they found is that, sorry, there's a
That's all right. Let
truck
them get
outside. Yeah.
let them get to work.
Um, that they found that even for these simple linear systems, the average internal states are actually not pointing towards these free energy minimum. And that was kind of posed as like a challenge to the free energy principle. And the mathematics behind that derivation, in my opinion, were totally sound. So it is true that actually, even in these uh, very simple linear diffusion systems, you don't get this kind of nice interpretation as internal states walking in the steepest direction towards the best inference. They're actually taking a more circuitous route towards the minimum, which entails the best inference. However, if you extend your kind of your definition of internal states to include also the active states and the sensory states. So the so-called particular states, the things that differentiate the particle from the external environment, then those things actually are pointing down free energy gradients. And this kind of is in line with this general idea that I think is a lot more in line with like the idea of sensory motor coupling. It's
Hmm.
not just the internal states that are doing inference, but the internal states are kind of cooperating or conspiring with your active states in
Right.
order to collaboratively get to that free energy minimum, at which point inference is exact or as exact as it can be given your approximations.
Yeah.
So it's saying, okay, I don't need to go the steepest way to the free energy minimum. I can take like a kind of curvy circuitous route, but I'm at the same time I'm pushing my active and sensory states in such a way that will actually minimize the time it takes us to get to the free energy minimum. And that was kind of the point of that article, or one of the points.
No, that's really useful. I'm just wondering. So when we talk about, so we're talking here about the sort of self-evidencing or the gradient descent of particular states. Um, should we is could we say that actually it might? What would it mean? Okay, what would it mean to say? What would it mean? What would it look like if I said we're doing gradient descent just on blanket states? So
Mm.
let's just ignore silo off the internal states for a second and just say are blanket states absent the internal states also do they also point down variational free energy gradients?
Yeah, I don't think that is guaranteed. Actually, I don't think blanket states are necessarily pointing down free energy gradients necessarily without taking into account sensory and or sorry internal states. So the internal states are kind of the things that are driving the active states to jointly minimize the free energy. And the free energy, recall, is defined on both the blanket and the internal states because it's defined on the observations, which are like the blanket states,
Yep.
and it's also defined on your beliefs over external states, which in this case are parameterized by internal states. So if you define the free energy just on the blanket states, I don't think it's guaranteed to, it will be minimized in the long run, but it's not guaranteed that the dynamics are pointing in the direction of steepest descent.
How
Um,
do you when people so I think people this is kind of coming to the kind of education of active inference, I guess, and part of this podcast is me learning and the audience learning alongside with me. When
mm,
people when people let you talk about internal states, I understand what it means to sort of parameterize beliefs over external states, and in some ways you're doing VFE because you want to return to like a set of external states which is viable for your existence. So fish are
mm.
not going to be found outside water, or I'm not going to be found in an ice cube, so on. Not ice cube, freezer. I don't know.
Yeah.
Now, my sort of a persistent question that I've always had, and I don't think anyone has really answered, and I'm not sure there is an answer, is that we say that the internal states are kind of the vehicle for these beliefs, but are they? Could you also just say they are these beliefs? Like, is there
Mm.
anything over and above the internal states beyond these Bayesian beliefs?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So this gets into a bigger question also about identifiability and uniqueness of the free energy principle and Bayesian mechanics. So in short, the internal states are not just simply the beliefs because they are whatever physically they are. Like if we're looking at a school of fish and we're saying these five fish are playing the role of the internal states, or looking at a cell, this part of DNA
Yeah.
is playing the role of the internal states. It's encoding production of proteins. That itself, that internal state doesn't have anything intrinsically. It's not parameterizing parameters of probability distributions over external states. So what's always at play when you're saying that the internal states are about or somehow representing external states is there's always a function there, which in the classic free energy literature is called the synchronization map. And what this is it's a function that takes your internal states and it maps them into the parameters of probability distributions.
Mm.
So if I want to, it's basically something that takes the raw, like dirty physics of the system, however it is. It's like, the metals and the ions and the things that actually consist of your system, and it's mapping them into a space of probability distribution. So if we wanted to say that my neurons are encoding beliefs about the position of objects in the room, what that function, that synchronization map would be doing is it would like take the firing rate of a neuron, which is like an actual physical neurophysiological property that I can measure from the neuron, and it's mapping it to something like the mean of a Gaussian distribution or the variance of a Gaussian distribution.
Mm.
So I guess in that sense, it's like, do you think that the firing rates of the neuron simply are the belief? I would say that, and actually this kind of hints at something I saw you talking about Alex Kiefer on one of your earlier podcasts, is like this kind of identity problem. Like,
Mm.
are the neural firing rates the belief, the representation themselves, or is there some map that takes the raw physics of the system and then maps it
Right.
into a probability distribution, into a representation? So I think you always do need that function that actually takes the system and maps it to a belief. But the problem with identifiability is it seems like there may be many candidate functions that take the system states and map them to a probability distribution over beliefs. So it's very hard to just look at a system and say, oh yeah, it's forming beliefs about like the average distance to neighbors, or the light refraction in the room, or the contrast of some image out there. We usually come to the table with very strong priors about, for instance, neural coding. We think that neurons either code things with the timing of spikes or they use like the firing rate. And that's how they do the encoding. And that's basically saying we come to the table with priors about what that function is. But in theory, there's nothing about the free energy principle that tells you what that function is. So it's a
Mm.
very hard like identifiability problem in general.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, another thing that kind of sticks in my mind when I think about this is where do the beliefs stop? So, at what point is something internal to the system, and what point is something external to the system?
Mm,
So, um, like for example, let's say there's something like me. Let's take as a kind of presupposition. I am conducting variational Bayesian inference, over the external states, but the external states in some strange way are also myself, right? Because they're also, let's say, the observations that come with respect to my glucose levels. Now,
mm,
that's because I need to have some beliefs, right? Some probability distribution that my glucose levels are going to tend towards a certain point.
mm,
In that, like, there is some internal belief about an external state, but that external state is actually still within me. Now,
mm.
we kind of get around this through this notion of embedded Markov blankets, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not actually parameterizing those beliefs, but actually my cells are. But I guess the point here and it comes back to a question that I've had loads of times, and people have had different answers to it. Is this just a useful structuring tool here, where I can
Mm,
just say, well, I don't really know why or how or when this Markov blanket ends and becomes part of a bigger order Markov blanket, and so on until you get something that it's like to be me. But
mm,
it's useful, and we can do some useful maths or useful physics based on it. Because I just
mm,
think, like, again, it's philosophically vague as to, does it make like, is the cell, is it part of the, is there just a straight elision really between an internal state and an external state from the perspective of a cell? Because it seems that it's also doing Bayesian beliefs on its own location, its
yeah.
own status, its own, right? Like, so I've always struggled with that with the free energy principle. Yeah, it makes sense for me that the internal states, I have to be parameterizing beliefs about where I am in the world or who
Mm,
I'm with and so on. But what about myself? I've got to be
mm,
about my glucose levels, my temperature, my well-being, and all the way down to my like very granular physics level.
yeah.
Like, where does
Totally.
it stop?
Yeah, exactly. I think the generic answer to this, I think is basically what you meant by embedded Markov blankets, which is if I look at like a coarse grained level, like more a psychological level of explanation, like you have beliefs about who's in the other room or what's behind your door. So that itself could be drawn out as like a Bayesian network where you have some sensory states, which are like your sensory organs, like your eyes and ears and nose. And then you have your internal state, which is like your psychological state or something, or some coarse grained representation of what your brain is thinking. And then you have that external state, which is like the presence or absence of another
Mm.
person. Each of those nodes in our Bayesian graph, we can kind of double click on and
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
zoom in. And that itself is a thing that has internal blanket sensory. So that's like the generic answer that people like Carl Friston will talk about with the renormalization group. Like you have Markov blankets at different scales, and of course the work of Maxwell Ramstead and people like that who are literally like writing papers about how exactly this happens. You have this nested Markov blanket. So I think that is the general answer is that every time we write down a Bayesian network and a graph, we're like saying, okay, that's the blankets, that's the internal, that's the external. Every time we do that, we're kind of admitting, well, actually, I can always like take what I consider a single state and just rip it up and like start partitioning that. And
Right.
then I think the ultimate conclusion of that exercise is basically your conclusion, which is it all becomes a matter of why are we doing this? Like, why am I at this level of zoomed outness, and it's probably for some practical utility as a modeler, as a neuroscientist, as a physicist. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we take the sort of psychological perspective, and let's say, so let's say actually we'll use your preprint. So the paper that I was mentioning before was from the, I believe it's collective behavior from surprise minimization. So that's
Mm.
a really great preprint that people can check out. It's obviously quite technical, but there's again lots of things that people can get out of it. Um, let's say we embed these, we're doing these Bayesian beliefs over the distance that I am from another person and the rate of change of that distance. I guess my question here is, am I also conducting Bayesian beliefs about where I am? Do I get
Mm.
where I am out of just like, do I get where I am just out of the beliefs about where other people are? Even
Yeah.
at this very psychological level, there's someone else in the other room. Do I also need to be doing Bayesian beliefs about myself in relation to those external world? And does that mean that I am also, in some ways, like I've got a dual perspective? I've got like this dual monism where I am doing the Bayesian belief about myself as if I was
Yeah.
part of the external world.
Yeah. Kind of like doing theory of mind on your own self, like
Kind of,
having to
yeah,
simulate your own inference process. Yeah. I mean, so I think the argument made in that collective behavior from surprise minimization paper is that you can get away without that
mm,
variable. Like you can get away with a lot of coordinated behavior where agents are tuning their own position and their velocity in space just by operating on very low level reflex arcs, basically just trying to minimize sensory prediction error. And so those agents in that paper don't have any representation of their own position. That's not like a latent variable in their generative model. All they do is they have some velocity vector, and that induces prediction errors. And what they can do is they can just change that velocity to basically reduce prediction errors. So you can get quite a lot of sophisticated behavior without that representation. However, I think there are plenty of good examples of systems, and maybe this gets more into like what you would call metacognition, although it doesn't even have to be that
yeah, yeah, yeah,
cognitive.
yeah.
But there are systems where you would like to have a representation of a random variable in your system that represents something like the self position,
Yeah.
and you would like to do inference over that variable, and that basically is what active inference is. If I have a variable that corresponds to some latent that can control my own body position or my speech or whatever, and doing inference over that latent variable is basically what ends up being some kind of agency or control.
Mm,
And I think the cases when you would want to have that extra variable are ones where the dynamics of yourself are are above and beyond what can just be determined from your sensory inputs. So for like these reflexive fish, I can get away without having a self variable because their behavior is pretty much completely a deterministic function of their sensory states. There is a little bit of like memory in there because they have the belief from the last time step of belief updating, but it's very simple. It's not like a very complex dependency. When you have individual agents that have a lot of like autonomy, I guess, which I would just parse into like more long-term nonlinear dynamics, then it makes sense to introduce another latent variable in your model that corresponds to something like myself or my position or my actions. And at that point, you're going to get more of like I would say, a tension between externally driven behaviors that are driven by sensory stimuli only and internal, more like endogenous or autonomous behaviors.
Yeah.
And those are the cases when you would want to put that latent variable in there.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this myself. We're just finishing up these edits for this flow states paper, and trying to explain sort of with Lars and Carl and others, and trying to explain sort of what it means for the, this is the self is the so-called sort of hidden, like one of just many hidden causes according to active inference, is a hypothesized
Exactly.
latent cause, and trying to explain kind of the difference between an internal cause and an external cause for something that's already presumably internal, right? Like me. And yeah, well,
Totally.
this is cool though. This is
Yeah.
definitely
I think I remember hearing, maybe you're probably more up to date with this, but I remember hearing Carl talk about like the idea that the very fact that we introduced something like a self
mm,
was basically a new structure in a generative model
mm,
in order to explain disparate input. So it's like
yeah,
I'm hearing a bunch of speech signals, and if I only have one latent variable in my model, which is like there is somebody speaking,
right,
then it's not going to be a good enough model of like the speech signals. And when you get enough of these like social signals, it actually becomes the free energy minimizing solution to break that node into two.
yeah,
And there's one that I can control, and there's one that's someone else that I can't control. And that's
exactly.
the best way to like explain the data.
Well, yeah, and presumably this is happening actually in developmental psychology and developmental biology, whereby a child doesn't
Uh,
really have a self other distinction. And I
mm,
always relate this back to, I think action is very important. So this is going
mhm,
back to the work of someone like Chris Frith and the comparator model, whereby I can make predictions about the consequences of my action. And the very
mm,
fact that I can do that and witness the sensory outcomes of my action means that I kind of get, well, I get this sensory motor arc, and
mm.
therefore I can have a higher order inference that there is something that internal to my generative model that is driving that action. I guess
Oh,
the
that's
question here is what's happening in something like a psychopathology, like thought insertion in schizophrenia, where people don't
mm,
trust that the thoughts that, well, I mean, I think this is actually kind of true, and I think the Buddhists actually flesh this out quite well. That obviously, if you actually meditate, you'll see that, well, the thoughts are not yours. Like they're not cut. You're not making the thoughts. But there's a classic thing in schizophrenia of like people who have schizophrenia will often think that the thoughts that they're thinking aren't theirs.
mm.
They're being beamed in by an alien or a government surveillance operation. And how you
That's
feed in something like a predictive model into that, unless you take thought as an action and then say, well, I'm predicting the outcomes of my thought and so on. And that becomes
right.
quite tricky because I guess we think of predictions as thoughts in some realist way. And so you end up with this circular loop. But yeah, it's
It's fascinating.
I
Yeah.
think it's, yeah, it is fascinating. I think this idea of the self as an inferred cause is reasonable. I think the only problem is that it engenders some kind of potential homunculus, which
Mm.
is sort of, well, what's doing the inference in the first place?
Yeah, exactly.
But these are questions for a
Yeah,
PhD.
that brings you back to having to define internal states. Like, well,
Right.
if the internal states are the self and you're inferring that that's even exists,
Yeah.
you need to define the inference process on some other subset of
Right.
states. Like
How
that's
did you
not
get
the
off the
internal
ground in the
states.
first place?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Well, you've just given me another paper idea and maybe a PhD idea. So, okay, awesome. I wanted to ask about this scene construction paper because I've been really interested in scene construction, and I was happy. I saw you work with Bette Mitzer, and I think his work is really amazing. Uh,
Mm.
and I just wrote his paper on attention, and it's super inspired by what he was doing with Carl and this, especially their selective attention paper, their 2019 paper.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Maybe just for the audience who probably have an idea and intuition what scene construction is,
Mm.
and they probably think of it as visual. Although I really like the sort of language example here.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
you could explain just at a very sort of high level what scene construction is.
Yeah, no, I like that you brought up the language example because that's actually what originally compelled me. Even when I saw those papers on scene construction, I actually immediately thought of it in terms of like parsing and language.
Mm,
A scene construction is just kind of a type of hidden variable inference. So I have a bunch of sparsely sampled data points, And then given that sequence of data points, like little sensory samples, I suddenly kind of infer something that's explaining all of them at once. Like, oh, this is the latent cause. This is the latent explanation that kind of unifies all um, these disparate data points. And I guess the construction aspect comes from two ways. One is the fact that usually the way we get that sequence of sparse data is through some kind of sampling. So, like, as I read a sentence, I'm in like Western languages, you're typically reading left to right.
Yep.
And as my eyes go right across the page, I'm gathering more evidence and I'm constructing the scene, as in my posterior probability distribution over these different explanations is kind of
Mm.
shifting until at some point, and often we see with human language and visual understanding, there's kind of this like nonlinear feedback where, oh, it kind of snaps into place. Oh, this is what's going on. And it's very interesting seeing this in language too, like in different languages, like German, for instance, the verb will come at the end of the sentence. So you kind of have to wait until the end of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
sentence
yeah, yeah, yeah.
before that meaning kind of snaps into place. So that's generally what I would describe as scene construction. And then in the visual case, often it's you might be looking at a painting or something like an ambiguous painting. Let's say some a modernist, maybe abstract thing with not very clear figures, and you're sparsely sampling it with your eyes, trying to figure out like what's actually going on here. And at some point when sampling, you get that gestalt impression
Mm.
of, oh, there's like a figure in a cloak or something, and that moment of gestalt recognition is like the act of constructing the scene, of inferring the latent explanation for all the sensory data that I've gathered. Yeah.
Excellent. That's really useful. I guess something that Beck's work really drove home to me and impelled me to write this paper was the importance of context. So if you're doing a sort of Yarbus task, where you have a picture, exactly what you just said, you have a picture, and then someone says, "Well, how rich are the family in this picture?" And then you scan all of the furniture and you look at their clothes, and then they ask something else, like, I don't know, I don't actually know what it is, but let's say, how well do they get along with each other? And you look at how they're sitting, and you look at whether they're
Mm,
looking at each other. So context is clearly driving a kind of overall the kind of derivation of a latent cause in some ways, because you're going,
totally.
okay, well, I'm going to pick out this evidence, and that's going to drive my inference.
Hmm.
So would you say that we're always integrating a kind of higher order context when we're doing scene construction, such that there is no such thing as the kind of neutral scene?
Mm,
It's always, the inference is always being driven by our recognition of where we are, what we are, and so on.
totally. Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of Bayesian modeling in general is like the ability for people to very rapidly infer a context,
Mm.
which in to map it back to the kind of abstraction I used to describe scene construction in the beginning is like you're inferring which latent explanations you're even testing.
Yeah,
So in
exactly.
the case of do you get the sense that the family in the painting is rich? You're suddenly that's inference of a rapid context that then induces which latent explanations am I interested in learning about,
Right.
like rich versus not rich. Whereas if the cue or the prompt was, is the man wearing a red shirt, then
Right.
the different latent explanations that you've suddenly inferred you have to test is a different set.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's like one of the most amazing and kind of underexplored abilities that humans and other animals have is they can use context to basically quickly infer a generative model. So
Mm,
like the context kind of selects the generative model that then you use to do something like active inference.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I've been thinking about this, because clearly it's just not computationally feasible to contemplate or assess every possible state. Right? I mean, this is the whole basis of variational Bayesian inference, is that
yeah,
kind
exactly.
of P of y is just it's almost infinitely diverse in its state space. And
Exactly.
so I've been kind of proposing that there's a higher order action policy which does the kind of pruning, to use kind
Mm,
of reinforcement language, the kind of pruning of your potential state space. And I've been thinking
totally.
about that a lot in terms of action, because even action, right, I don't consider doing absolutely everything at
Mm-mm.
any given time. Have you got any other like further intuitions about how that might work? Because I think the slight tricky thing here is that we have a kind of higher order policy, let's say, to prune our state space, but that needs itself to be driven by observation, right?
Yeah.
Like I need to know, okay, I'm going to prune accordingly because I've observed something in the world, right? Like, so I see that it's raining, for example, in London right now, and so like I'm just immediately pruning swimming trunks and sunglasses and so on. But
Yeah.
I needed to do that observation in the first place. So it sounds like I got to have a higher order action policy to observe the world to drive my context. I'm just curious about how deeply recursive does that go?
Yeah, I think like the overall I mean, I would like to think that there's a generic solution where you basically can start with no structure and like build everything from scratch. But I think there's basically no free lunch here.
Yeah.
Even, and I agree with you that like maybe the best way to explain human behavior is that you're inferring a context or inferring something that then allows you to prune or select a model that then you can use in practice. But the process by which you do that also assumes some kind of model. Like, what's the model by which you infer I need to act to do this? Where those models come from, these like deep hyper priors about the spaces of models that I can select at like a lower level, those are probably things that are developmentally inborn. That's probably the space that like evolution actually works on. Like on
Yeah.
the space of kind of hyper priors or deep hyper models that like babies are born with in their brain. And these things are probably things that you and I couldn't elucidate in like in human cognitive neuroscience is like a probability of the dots moving right versus left. Like that's a likelihood we can write down. These kinds of models that are like the models about how do I select which structures to use for a given task, those are probably very hard to put into words, but those are the
Mm,
sorts of things that I expect developmental psychologists have somewhat of a hold on. Like these, they probably have to do with like intuitive folk physics, like things like there are objects, there are agents, there are things with like spatio-temporal correlations over time, like very deep physical constructs. But I do think that at a more mechanistic level, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I think like one way you could formulate this is in terms of mixture models. So mixture models is like I have some assignment variable that's very high up that tells me which model am I using right now. And so the mixing variable is what you infer.
mm,
And then given the inference of the mixing variable, that effectively selects one of 5 or 10 or 1,000 different alternative explanations for the data. And usually those are models of the same form, like a Gaussian mixture model is a mixture of Gaussians. But I
mm.
think in what you're discussing, what you're mixing are like totally alternative structures. Like one structure that I'm inferring, one context I'm inferring I'm in is like I'm driving a race car. Another context is that I'm talking to a friend or a colleague. And those
Right.
are totally different models. I think one place where the mixture model falls apart is with mixture models, you would assume that when you infer that higher level assignment, sometimes that inference can kind of be wide. So you're not sure what context you're in.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
when you look at human behavior, people tend not to mix contexts. There's probably
Right.
some experimental paradigms where you get that, but oftentimes people infer like they kind of select, like, I'm definitely going to make these assumptions going forward. I'm definitely going to make these. So there might be something like a better model of structure selection than mixture models. But that would be one idea, I think, like mathematically where to get started would to be looking at like mixtures of structures effectively.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Nice. I spoke to Sanjeev Namjoshi about this on the podcast, who's at Versus with you, and it was actually
Right.
yesterday I spoke to him about it, and we went back
Oh,
and
cool.
forth, and I think we ended up grounding it out in evolution. So I think you're absolutely right. I think
Yeah.
there are a couple of things I want to say to that. One is it's always I tell everyone this on this podcast and personally that I think it's always a bit dangerous to just take one slice of the generative model at one slice of time and take that to be what's actually happening. It's
Mm,
always dynamic. The observations are always feeding into the upper levels, which are feeding back down. And I guess that's the beauty of a kind of predictive coding or a deep parametric modeling system is that like this is just an idealization. It's constantly happening
yeah, totally.
recursively. um, I think the other like point of complexity here is that not only do we need to, let's say, derive a context, we also have to derive the salience of a context or like the relevance
Mm,
of a context. So, I wrote this paper where I'm kind of talking about a circular causality between preferences and attention.
mm,
And something that I kind of realized was, I knew it obviously because it's just from my life that if I'm hungry, like if I'm truly starving, I'm not. I don't care about anything else that's on like that seems fundamentally peripheral at that time, whether that's finishing a paper or you know being on my phone and so on, which means that like there's almost not only is there a higher order policy that I prune my state space according to the fact that I'm now hungry, but also that now trumps any other possible state space, like I'm on my phone or I'm writing my essay, which implies that there's like an even higher level precision weighting policy that says, well,
Yeah.
not only do you have to prune accordingly, but you also have to prune in a hierarchical fashion.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
That's
Again, I don't know how deep this goes because, as Carl will tell us, anatomically the brain is very ridgy and very
yeah.
recursive.
Yeah, that's true. No, that I mean that also reminds me, I think, of this paper of Burke's that you mentioned from 2019, right? Because if I remember correctly, that version of selective attention actually depended on the preferences.
Yeah.
Is that right? So yeah, that's something like other than that work by Burke, and I guess the paper you're discussing now, I don't know of much work that explicitly uses the preferences to then select what generative model is being used for inference. Because you're absolutely right. It's not just, oh, I have some observations, then I infer the context, which then tells me how to act. But that inference also depends on like what your goals are, like what is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
important right now. And usually we get importance in the kind of classic model-based reinforcement learning ways. We roll out a given policy and we see how much does that policy overlap with what I want,
Mm.
like a reward function. We
Mhm.
basically evaluate policies in terms of reward functions. But what you're suggesting maybe cannot be accommodated in that way, where the actual inference itself is biased by, it's not just policy selection, but even state selection or state inference is biased by what's important, what's relevant. And I think there are ways you can get that. Like there's this generalized free energy paper by Thomas Parr and Carl Friston from 2019, where they show that in that particular formulation of variational free energy called the generalized free energy, you actually do get this interesting influence on state inference from preferences. So your preferences will kind of optimistically bias your state inference so
Mhm.
that you'll only be doing inference about things that kind of matter for
Mhm.
your action selection. So that might be one place to
I
also.
wish Carl had pointed me in the direction of that paper because he read it. He read my paper and then obviously he didn't tell me about this one. That sounds absolutely right. Yeah, because I mean, my way of coming at it was thinking, well, in principle, there's near infinite things that I can optimize my free energy minimization over, right? Like and there are ways out of this. I mean, some people will talk about something like, Julian Kiverstein or Mark Miller or Mark Anderson will talk about aerodynamics. So it's not enough just
Mm,
to minimize free energy. There needs to be a constantly improving slope of prediction error minimization. But
mm,
I still don't think that does it because in principle, I could just get way better at tidying my room. But like that's just or something extremely trivial. But
yeah,
that's not going to cut it ultimately because I might just end up starving.
yeah,
So it's exactly as you said. I still think this can be couched in terms of something like an expected free energy
mm,
function. It's just higher order, and
yeah,
everything trickles down from it, such that, as you
mm,
say, like now we have like a selected generative model. In truth, I haven't thought too much about how this could be implemented mathematically because I
yeah.
think you know,
That's the place that because that is, yeah, that's totally true. You could actually say, because the typical way we do the expected free energy is in like this brute force enumeration. Like, let's say I did this, I
yeah,
did X versus Y. If I did X, what would my expected free energy look like? It would be a combination of the utility, which is like the preferences, and then this information gain.
hmm
If you were to evaluate that brute force for like model selection, like if I was to select this model and then go through a whole round of
right,
active inference
right,
with this
right,
model, it just becomes very hard to compute the expected free energy, I think. So maybe there's just a better algorithm or implementation that would allow you to kind of heuristically evaluate these counterfactual consequences of like, if I selected this model, what would my would that make me less hungry? Would that like sate me?
right.
Um, but you probably have to come up with some heuristic or some clever way to get around the enumeration.
Well, I wonder whether it could just be belief free, whether you might just like we might just have contextually cued model selection such that
Mm,
the moment that I have the slightest drop in my glucose, then the whole thing cascades down such that I
mm,
have the prioritization of seeking food, and I don't even have to run the expected free energy of I could go here, I could go there, I could go here, and what am I, how well am I going to do?
yeah,
Rather, I just have this one. Now I just at the very bottom of all that process, I just have this one preference, which is eat.
yeah.
And I think something like that might hijack or shortcut the whole process, leading to
Yeah,
like quite low compute, but actually a
yeah,
pretty robust way of like getting adaptation. Because presumably this is something similar to what a child is doing, right? Like,
yeah.
and I think that kind of works in terms of like, I don't know, like the simplicity of children in some ways, that they sort of cry over anything, which kind of
Mhm.
implies that there is just like a very simple stimulus response mapping. And I wonder whether
Totally.
that could just be expanded, just more broadly to model selection.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that ultimately is probably what's really happening in biology, because this also extends across the biological spectrum. Like animals are very context, or like basically need driven. Like things like attention, all these basic cognitive faculties are really enslaved to effectively the basic things that the lower brain is telling the body it needs to do, like breathing, eating, thirst, sleeping. So I think ultimately it is some fast stimulus response mapping. I think the only issue with that is it does kind of it seems less principled, right? It seems like, oh, we just have to hack in a short circuit, and it's not just like evolving through a neat process of free energy minimization. Maybe it is, but it's just happening on a slower time scale.
Right.
Like it's some slow accumulation of experience evolutionarily that has trained this short circuit inference to say,
Exactly.
if
Yeah.
I'm hungry, yeah,
There might have been some EFE calculation on the part of evolution to select for,
yeah,
stimulus response mappings for something very like fundamental, like food or sleep or breathing and so on.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, that's given me lots of ideas I need to think about.
It's really nice, yeah.
Final sort of topic I want to touch on is, just before we went live, we spoke a little bit about you being at Versus
Mm,
full time, and I wanted to sort of ask again. I know, speaking to Sanjeev and others, that everything is very under the wraps, and I respect that. And I don't want Maxwell to come and shake me. But so I was curious, just at a very sort of high level, you've gone from biology, so thinking about biological feasibility, to modeling and artificial intelligence, and trying to ground something in, trying to take biotic cognition and say, well, what makes that intelligent, and then can we replicate that in silico or in a
mhm,
robot. I was just wondering, how biologically feasible are certain assumptions made by active inference modelers? So,
mm,
for example, active inference modelers talk about, this again, not exactly my bag, but a mean field approximation, for example,
all
where
right.
presumably, the hidden states or the different tensors have conditional independence.
Mhm,
How you can take that one, you can take any other, or just any
yeah.
other assumptions more broadly. Does this seem to you actually biologically feasible, or is it just like an interesting modeling tool?
No, yeah, it's actually those are probably the most interesting and important examples of the assumptions we make. So I think the biggest one in one word is factorization. The models, both the generative model that animals have, as well as their Q, their approximate posterior, which they
Mm,
optimize using free energy minimization, those almost necessarily have to be simplified, in my opinion. There's some people who believe that the brain is doing like sampling based inference, in which case they can actually be doing full posteriors, in which they don't need any simplifications in their model of the world. They're doing full posterior inference on their model. I don't think that really holds up, because it's way too slow to be useful for the time scale that biology needs to work on. So I think those assumptions, like factorization in the generative model, those are quite realistic,
mm,
and factorization in the posterior, in this approximate posterior. I think that's actually one of the coolest things about variational inference, is it seems like something that brains can do.
mm,
Because once you make these factorization assumptions, what it gives you are updates to your beliefs that are beautifully local. Like they only need nearby information. And this is kind of the whole rallying cry of people like Bert DeVries, who work on these message passing and factor graph schemes. What's beautiful about that is it's distributed and local, and that locality inherits from the fact that we're making factorizations, or we're making assumptions of certain variables in my model or in my beliefs are independent of each other. The question, like a specific question, is the mean field factorization appropriate? That one assumes that all the different state factors are conditionally independent, actually just fully independent. That one I think is an open question. And so there's basically a knob we can turn from like fully factorized where everything's super cheap and local, but you're introducing approximation error. As soon as you start making these assumptions, your beliefs are not going to be as good at actually explaining the data and minimizing free energy. On the other side, we have fully enumerated, combinatoric, entangled beliefs and explanations for the world, which are maybe the most accurate, but doing inference on them is going to be expensive and take a long time. So the open question in my mind for biology, if we're trying to really map biological processes to like variational Bayesian inference, is like where on that sliding scale is biology or our particular systems. And
Right.
so a lot of the work that we're trying to do at Versus is basically find good settings of that knob. Like we want to figure out what is a setting of factorization of complexity we can build into these models that they're still sufficiently expressive and and generalizable. They generalize across contexts, across tasks, but they're not computationally insane.
Yeah.
Like we
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
make things
Yeah.
cheap, and we need to also, we would ideally like to make them cheap enough that we could imagine neural wetware implementing them with like local computation.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's yes. I mean, I guess that is the kind of well, that's always the accuracy complexity trade off, right? I mean, it's built into the
Pretty
very
much.
equations. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
I started in my introduction by asking about what I mentioned in my introduction, apparent teleology.
Mm,
And actually, this was probably the first question I ever had in when I discovered active inference. What you know, a year and a bit ago, which is, well, what is free energy, right? Like, is there a little sensor in the brain that is like cued into this? Like, again, this was me being very naive. Is this like little thing and it's sensing free energy and it's trying to get it down to this minimum, which again, now I think about it, obviously implies some kind of action policy that is descending down free energy gradients.
mm-hmm.
So, but like, it is a naive question, but in some ways it's useful, I think, because it feeds into an intuition, which is human. There was a long-standing debate about like what life is, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like the Elan Vital, is there like some special source that we put into humans that just like means that we self-organize? And I guess this is just
Yeah.
a perennial problem, which is, well, why are we doing this in the first place, right? Cole tells us that if we are doing, if I can say that you're Connor today and you're Connor tomorrow, I can kind of describe what you've done, but like why you do that is a kind of mystery. And I think
Totally.
some people intuitively think, well, maybe there's this adaptive sensor in the brain which tracks like this kind of special, thing called free energy, which is probably not happening. Let's be honest.
Mm,
And it's obviously an informationally theoretic term that makes things tractable from a
mm-hmm.
modeling perspective. But when you're talking about putting that into an artificial agent, the question that comes to my mind is there anything else that you need to do? Is there a higher order prior, for example, that you need to put into it that means that it actually will act to minimize variational free energy? That actually
Yeah.
will self-organize? Because there's
Yeah.
like, it's kind of like, why does a computer work? Like I've always just what's the kind of fundamental thing? And maybe in the case of computer or humans, it's electricity. Is there anything like that you need to kind of put in that means that it just doesn't just sit there and is built with these beautiful priors, but doesn't really act in accordance with them?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really deep question. I mean, so at a fundamental level, you're I totally agree with you that there's no secret sauce, there's no special signal. As soon as I've written down any equation of motion that doesn't explode,
Yeah,
any equation of motion for systems that just generally keep existing. Another way of saying that is I've written down I can write the dynamics of that system with some free energy functional. So, as designers of artificial systems, we have the luxury of not having to write down an equation of motion
mm,
in such a particular way that we know if we backed out the Bayesian mechanics of it, oh, look, it's actually minimizing free energy. We can start with the free energy.
yeah,
So, as artificial engineers, we can say, no, we're going to actually have these things integrate equations of motion that minimize free energy. So
right,
that's what we do. But systems like self-organizing biological systems, in the same way on the savannah, the giraffes' necks are not getting longer to reach the trees because they want to optimize
yeah, yeah,
fitness.
yeah, yeah,
That's a post hoc, like apparently teleological description for the dynamics of systems, and then we put a sauce on it, a descriptive sauce called fitness or called natural selection. That's the exact same thing with free energy. There's just dynamics, and then post hoc we dress it up with, well, these dynamics look like they're actually doing approximate Bayesian inference, and that's a cool, useful, in my opinion, framing. In the same way, natural selection is a cool, useful framing for statistical filtering of phenotypes over generations. But as artificers, as builders and engineers, we can actually write systems that optimize fitness. We can write an algorithm. We could write a genetic algorithm that does it automatically, kind of. We can also write an algorithm that directly surfs a fitness landscape. And in the same way, we can directly write algorithms that minimize free energy. The problem is, like, we now have the burden of proof of having to write down a generative model and to figure out what the best free energy functional for a given task is. I think a more like almost like complex systems way of designing a system would be to actually just like design a bunch of particles in a vat and
Mm,
write and like basically design physics, like design a particular sandbox of physics that emergently gives rise to agents that minimize free energy without
mm,
actually plugging that in at the lower
yeah,
level.
that's the
But that's hard
that's
though.
yeah, that's kind of where I was leaning, right? Like,
I see. Yeah.
I guess like it does bring into mind sort of just fundamental questions of teleology,
Yeah.
uh, and makes you think, well, why is physics doing this in the first place? And as you say, like, can we have like it probably would be in silico? Can we get these kind of particles that just do it? And is there a way that we could get to the bottom of that rung without invoking another axiom or another miracle or another process? And
Mm.
maybe not. It's yeah,
Is
that's
it
yeah.
is your thinking that if we did it that way, so we started by just like writing down very simple physics of like particles in a vat, and then we get the Bayesian mechanics emergent for free, is because I've thought about this as well. In your thinking, is that like, is there an advantage to doing it that way rather than top down?
Well, I think there's an advantage in the sense that to my kind of eyes, there's a slight difference in between natural selection and active inference, and
Mm,
that's because I think um, with natural selection you get both the principle and the process.
mhm,
Now there are obviously some axioms and miracles. Now I'm not a geneticist, so don't shoot the messenger. But like the basic idea obviously is that you get the mutations. And
mhm,
mutations are what drive natural selection because it leads to kind of differentiation within the pool of genes. If you take a very sort of gene focused form of Darwinian natural selection, but that gives you both the principle. Okay, over time, given mutations, there will be optimization for fitness just for free because
mm,
you just get obviously you get the things that are successful in the genes that permit reproducing themselves being reproduced and so on. But with variational free energy and active inference and the free energy principle, you get the principle. What you don't necessarily get is the process. Namely, what Carl tells you is if things persist, this is what they have to. We can describe them using these mechanics. But
mhm,
it doesn't give you why things persist.
mhm,
So that's kind of what I mean. And I do think that if you had a kind of completely neutral system, because, okay, the reason why some of these queries come to mind is because I think in the older papers, the older active inference papers, they would very subtly squeeze in this thing where it would say, well, there's also the higher order or higher order action policy to minimize free energy.
mhm.
And then that, I think, is a very philosophically fraught thing because then you go, well, is there a higher order policy for that policy? And so
Yeah.
on, right? And evolution obviously grounds some of this out. But it makes me think like, sure, it's a really lovely scientific tool, but the power is really in the process theories, whether
Mm,
that's
mhm.
cognitive coding, active inference, variational message passing, POMDP schema, whatever you want, because you don't get the process for free from the free energy principle. And I think in that there's a slight difference with evolution.
Totally. Yeah. I see exactly what you mean. Yeah. I mean, I guess so it depends on how you define evolution. I would potentially argue that natural selection is even happening in non-biological systems. And it's just the process theory that provides the equivalent of mutation is maybe slightly different.
Right.
But I guess you could still say that, well, there's still a mutation. Like it's just
There's
what is
change.
there? Yeah, it's a change exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah,
think I my hunch is that something like that could also be identified for variational free energy minimization, but I think it would be something that maybe would not be satisfying like dynamics. Like you need, which is another way of saying change. You need some function that maps a state to another state, and that if you iteratively apply that function, it doesn't diverge to infinity.
yeah.
And I think that would be like the kind of process theoretic equivalent of mutation in natural selection. Yeah.
I'm sure someone's going to do it. It probably
Yeah.
won't be me. Probably will be Carl. Let's be honest. Yeah, it comes back, I think, to this idea that Kate was talking about. I haven't read her book, but I know it's out, which is that maybe a slight concern with active inference and the free energy principle is that at its very core, it rests on some kind of determined characteristics.
Hmm.
And maybe, I mean, all theories have their axioms, right? I mean, all theories have their miracles, and natural selection definitely has its miracles,
Hmm.
but it's very neat and clever, and it all wraps up quite nicely. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right that maybe there's a little bit more work to do to really get the process of like why things don't just fall apart. I mean, this
Yeah.
was Schrodinger's big question, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and Carl's big question, but yeah, I think it's very important for an audience to realize that when we talk about active inference being the overarching theory of everything, that's probably it never really made those claims.
Yeah, I totally agree. We don't have the physics of why things don't fall apart yet. We've assumed that that physics works and is there, and then we do the free energy
Yeah,
principle.
yeah, 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 yeah. And which makes one think, and again, this is no disrespect to Carl or you or Max or anyone who's deeply invested in this, like exactly how much are we getting out of the free energy principle? Because I think Carl himself takes a very deflationary or tautologist count of the free energy principle, which is that it just says if things persist, they act and perceive like things that would persist do, right? Like things act in accordance with themselves if they are to exist as themselves.
Mm,
But as I said, how things do that, right? You have to do that. If I make the fundamental presupposition that you are the same thing today as tomorrow, like you have to at least be obeying by that principle.
mm.
How you do that, well, I guess we'll never. Well, we might know. Um, Connor,
Yeah.
this was really, really fun.
Totally.
No, it's these are wonderful, deep questions, and I'm actually just very glad. I think something that people need to be more of is epistemically humble, and say where they don't know the answer. And I'm very much in admiration of the fact that you're willing to say that there are plenty of things that this community still doesn't know. Um,
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
so, and yeah, the insights are just wonderful. I mean, I my final question actually is just a curiosity, which is you were a neuroscientist, right? So, master's neuroscience, PhD neuroscience.
Mm.
How on earth did you learn all the maths and the physics? I'm just
Yeah.
out of curiosity.
No, that's a great question. Yeah, so I did my bachelor's in kind of more cognitive neuroscience, doing a lot of EEG, psycholinguistic stuff. So not really math heavy at all. And then in my last year of bachelor's, I took one computational neuroscience class at University of Pennsylvania. It was Vijay Balasubramanian. He was the teacher. And it just really turned my mind not only to comp neuro, but then all the methods that you need to know to do
Right.
proper computational neuroscience. And that kind of just opened the Pandora's box a little bit. And then I did a 2-year internship at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and we were doing again like translational preclinical neuroscience working with rats and mice. And just during the evenings during that 2-year stint, I was taking all these like machine learning and computational neuroscience classes that
Cool.
at the time in like 2015 were still like free on Coursera. So like
Mm,
Andrew Ng's course, Jeff Hinton's class. And I just like had to teach myself a bunch of math. And it was annoying and hard, but I think it helped me catch up a lot to a point where I could then go and read Carl's papers and actually like kind of understand what's going on.
yeah.
But it was definitely a really long and like self-taught journey. And because of that, I do have a lot of like foundational gaps in math that people like Lance DeCosto, like you can clearly tell by talking to him, he doesn't have those gaps because he
Yeah.
has that proper education.
Well, I'll tell you, there's one man with the biggest gap of them all, and that's me. So the PhD will be fun.
It'll be great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll be bootstrapping our way to some kind of mathematical adequacy. Um,
definitely.
Wonderful, 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 wonderful. So much to think about. So many wonderful insights and great intuitions. And yeah, it's just been an absolute pleasure on my part. And I'm sure
Likewise.
everyone will benefit accordingly. So
Thanks. Yeah, it's been so nice. Thanks for inviting me in the first place. And it was really a pleasure talking to you. It was great.
wonderful. Conor, thank you so, so much again.
Thank you.